Hi, friends. It's Brittany Valadez here for BravelyDaily.com. Friends, I am so excited for you to join me for today's conversation that is so important. If you are having health problems or you know someone who has health problems and you maybe want to hear different alternative viewpoints and also you just want to know what's going on with, the government and the FDA, this is a conversation for you. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm simply asking questions and I have my own thoughts and you will hear them throughout the video. I want to encourage you to listen to Katy's advice and to see what she has to say. We talked everything from abortion pills, birth control, vaccines, diet, heavy metals, FDA. I mean, a lot of controversial topics. You know what? Let's just get straight into the interview. Hi, Katy. It's so nice to meet you. And right off the bat, I have to say, I noticed something on your wall. I recognize that signature. Um, can you tell us a little bit about who you are? And you actually have quite an amazing resume. So, yeah, let's introduce
Thank
yourself.
you, Brittany. It's really nice to be here. So that signature comes from my time in the White House. It's my presidential commission. When you get appointed to certain political appointments, you get a commission. And so it's signed by Donald Trump, Donald J. Trump there. So I worked in the White House as the healthcare policy lead for the Domestic Policy Council. I was the lead healthcare advisor on health and also values issues like life and gender, religious liberty. And then before that, I had done off and on Capitol Hill for a number of different senators in the U.S. Senate. But I'm a trained epidemiologist and a naturopathic doctor by training.
Wow. Honestly, I am blown away by your resume and we're going to get straight into this. I have so many questions for you, so I'm excited for us to have this opportunity to talk.
Yesterday were oral arguments before the Supreme Court for a case called the FDA versus the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, along with three other medical doctor groups, which are pro-life or religious-based groups, they sued the FDA over its taking away certain protections associated, guardrails, safeguards associated with its approval of the abortion pill. There are two abortion pills that have to be taken in concert together. And the first of them is called mifepristone. And it's the one that actually expels the baby from the uterus. The other one kills the baby. So you take them both, unfortunately. And what had happened is this drug, when it was first approved under the Clinton administration in 2000, right before Clinton left the White House, they approved this pill. And it was such an emergency kind of out of the norm type approval because, of course, this pill is not safe and effective. It kills one patient and temporarily injures the other by design. And so they did some trials and it led to a lot of bleeding and craziness. And so they put these safeguards on. And the safeguards were that you have to take the drug in the presence of a physician. You have to be administered the drug with a physician visit. And also that physician needs to assess whether your pregnancy is ectopic, meaning the baby's lodged in your fallopian tube and not your uterus, in which case taking the drug is extremely dangerous for the mother and not just the baby. But they also want to assess the age of the baby, the gestational age, because if the pregnancy is too far along, then again, very dangerous for the mother as well as the designed danger for the baby. So that physician appointment's very important to prevent problems. And then there was another physician visit that was required after the administration of the drug, a day or two later, to make sure that you're not bleeding out, that you don't have some horrific infection, that the baby actually came out, and that you don't need to complete the abortion with a surgical process. So that was really important too, because what we've seen, and this is right there on the FDA label, is that up to 1 in 25 women end up in the emergency room after they take this drug. And part of that reason is because, you're bleeding and cramping and having these horrible symptoms, which are indistinguishable from an emergency hemorrhage by design. You're supposed to be bleeding and cramping and pushing that baby out with all the uterine lining. And so it's going to look exactly like an emergency hemorrhage. And yet it's to be expected. It's not even considered an adverse event when that happens because that's what it's supposed to do. That's the point. And so you can't tell if you're having an emergency or not. And It's extremely painful, often traumatic, and women, get horrified and they end up in the emergency room for good reason. So the FDA in 2000 said, yes, you need to have a physician visit after you take the drug to make sure you're doing okay and that everything's going as expected. Well, in 2016, when President Obama left office, right before he left office, he took off the requirement to have that second doctor visit. And so that wasn't great. But then after COVID, and especially after the Dobbs ruling, the Biden administration took off the first doctor visit. And so now you just have to get the drug prescribed. Now, of course, doctors have to prescribe drugs. It's not just anybody who can just prescribe drugs, nurse practitioners and other prescribers who are authorized, but you can do that online. So what ended up happening is this was kind of a stick in the eye to the pro-life states after the Dobbs ruling, who were now enacting pro-life laws and banning chemical and surgical abortions in their borders. And so this was a way to get around those laws. You can just see a Planned Parenthood provider in California, and they will mail the drugs to you in Texas or whatever pro-life state you live in. And, you can basically administer your own abortion, lying in a pool of blood on your own bathroom floor instead of at the Planned Parenthood. So that's kind of what happened. And a group of pro-life and Christian doctors sued the FDA to say, hey, this isn't safe for women. This is terrifying. And there are way too many complications. And by the way, has the science changed since you thought this used to be required and necessary and important for public health 20 years ago? What in those 20 years changed to change your scientific judgment? Nothing. And so they sued for a violation of public health policy here. And so I think the first case went up through the federal district court where they won. But then the Fifth Circuit, I believe, stayed that decision. And so they were appealing up to the Supreme Court, and oral arguments were yesterday. Alliance Defending Freedom is their lawyers. And so Aaron Hawley argued the case yesterday. And we could talk about how it went. It was sort of a mixed bag.
I got to commend you for the courage to speak out. And it just reminds me of Esther, especially as it's Holy Week, 3 days, she had to fast and pray. And then I'm thinking of the courage for her to speak. So first of all, can you tell us what this drug is? Because some people may hear about it and think, oh, well, I want to just end my pregnancy. I have this and this and this reason. I can just pop a pill and it's done. But from what I've just heard you describe, it sounds horrific. I mean, let alone the morality of just ending the life of a human being. Not only but it's also affecting the mother as well. And a lot of times people just want the simple way out, which is, unfortunately, for most of these abortions, it's the simple way out. Can you tell us what exactly is in this drug, and why do you think the FDA would approve such a drug?
Yeah, so it is a really scary medication, if you can even call it a medication. It is designed to basically induce labor, is essentially what's happening. So that your uterus starts to shed the uterine lining and your muscles contract to push out the baby and everything associated with the baby in your uterus. That takes place starting within 2 to 12 or 2 to 24 hours of taking the pill. And so, you're going to be basically laid up at home for a few days usually. If anyone saw that movie Unplanned, which is about the life of Abby Johnson, the former Planned Parenthood director, yeah, she experiences this. And we see it as in the scene in that movie where, she's basically in her bathroom or shower and she's just bleeding out, and it's horrific. That is absolutely normative. That is usually what happens. They don't tell you might have pain, you might have bleeding. No, you will have pain, you will have bleeding. That's the point. You're basically in labor. And so it can be more than half of women also experience less severe effects as well, including nausea, fever, dizziness, lightheadedness. And so, what women find is it's sort of like when you feel really nauseous and you just want to lay on the bathroom floor because it's cold and for some reason that feels better, or when you have really bad period cramps, that's what it's like, only times 1,000. And the blood loss is far more than a period. So what they'll say is, you're going to have the worst bloodiest period you've ever had. And that's what it's like. It's like far worse than a period and a lot of blood loss. And so you can understand why women would not know if this is an emergency, right? This is something they've never experienced before. The severity of it, yes, they were told maybe by the online doctor that they got this drug from. Maybe they were told to expect this, but that's very different from experiencing it, which is much scarier than anything you maybe have experienced before. And so women naturally start to freak out and worry, and they don't have anyone to call. Half the time, this is all secret, and they haven't told anybody, and certainly not, someone who loves them. And, by dealing with a telemedicine provider, like let's say that you're dealing with a telehealth provider who prescribes this for you, like you don't have anyone to call. What are you going to do? Email them? So, it's really scary. And, if things are going badly, like the baby isn't fully coming out all the way, and, there's still elements of the pregnancy still left within the uterus that are continuing to bleed, that is an emergency situation. And so it's very hard to tell whether I'm having an emergency now or this is to be expected or what. Like it's very confusing. And in fact, if you read the FDA label for this drug, they have this sort of tortured section on the label trying to explain this. They're like, well, you should expect all these horrific things. But of course, you could have an emergency also at where these same horrific things happen. So good luck. And that's why we need a doctor here. And all that this case is really about is just making sure that women have a clinician who is in charge of this process with them, and someone they can call and someone who's paying attention. We're not actually, as much as I would love to end abortion globally, that's not what the lawsuit is trying to do. The lawsuit is just saying, hey, could we go back to the scientific, the safeguards that you thought were scientifically necessary 5 minutes ago? Why can't we just go back to that? Women were able to get these chemical abortions back then, before Dobbs. And so we just want that same status quo to be the case. And so, there's scaremongering from the pro-abortion side that's saying, you're trying to take away this option from women. And really, that's not the case. Like, we're just trying to go back to the Clinton policy, which is hardly a pro-abortion, pro-life policy. So, that's what's really scary here, is that these were all, Democratic presidents who had put this in place, and we're just trying to get back to that policy, which we found disturbing enough. So, it's scary. It's just a scary situation, but it's just one example of many by the FDA in their sort of declared war on mothers and babies. I mean, I think we've seen this war being declared by them in a number of areas. It's not just this. It's also approving, the COVID vaccine for babies on the basis of, limited mouse data. It's approving the COVID vaccine for pregnant women when pregnant women were excluded from the trials, as they should be, right? We don't experiment on pregnant women when we don't know the impact on an unborn baby or the pregnant woman. So that's one. There's heavy metals that are in transitional baby foods that most babies eat when they're weaning off breast milk or formula, that are riddled with heavy metals, and the FDA has refused to set binding guidelines on manufacturers to keep lead and cadmium and arsenic out of baby foods. That's been going on for decades, the FDA has known about, and Congress has investigated. Patient activist groups have tried to get them to set these binding guidelines, and instead they've said, oh, well, it might be hard for manufacturers to clean up the heavy metals out of their food, so I guess they shouldn't have to. Like, that's the FDA's position. And then, of course, the baby formula shortage, which went on for years because the FDA dithered and wouldn't set, guidelines to require manufacturers to report when there was a problem with their product in the baby formula space. And there's so many others, especially in the food space. We haven't even really talked about food so much as all these pharmaceutical products, but the regulatory capture here. Yeah. Okay. The regulatory capture is really bad. I mean, it's either they're in bed with big pharma, like this is just regulatory capture and they love their regulated entity clients, or they're in bed with just, the big abortion industry that wants to create this like telemedicine Amazon of abortion. And so they're just kind of political hacks with an ideological agenda. Like either way, it's or both, it could be both, and I think it probably is. Either way, they're a threat to public health, not a protector of public health at this point.
Absolutely. As I'm listening to you speak, I have so many thoughts going on in my head. And I think, first of all, yeah, it reminds me of, if we go back to the Bible and we look at Adam and Eve, it's Satan always, or even when Satan was tempting Jesus, he takes a little bit of truth and he twists it. And I feel that a lot of times the government is trying to make the women feel that they care about you, and we just care about your health, and we really don't. We really want a future for you. And if that doesn't include a child, that they're holding you back, oh, well, then do this. And then women, a lot of times we think with our emotions, and that's where we have to follow scripture, where we can't just follow our heart because it's deceitful. And we have to look at logic and, first of all, look at the word of God and say, wait, first of all, is this morally correct? Would God allow this? No, he would never support killing an innocent human being. Never. So there's that. And people can be easily manipulated by the government. And then my other thought is this: when it comes to, maybe somebody will argue with you and say, hey, well, you know what? You may say that this drug is horrible and it's preventing human life. Well, or killing human life. Well, why not go and give these women birth control? Now, this is interesting. I've been reading a lot about how Gen Z is pushing back on birth control, that a lot of doctors prescribe for, oh, you have pimples? Well, here's this pill. What are your thoughts on birth control, and is it a safe drug to take?
Oh my goodness. What a can of worms. Yes, it's one of my favorite topics. I wrote about this almost a decade ago, and was, roundly pilloried for it. But yeah, I mean, I'll just start with my personal story. My personal story is that I had horrific period cramps when I was a teenager. Horrific. I mean, really from the time I was 11 years old and had my first period. It was horrible, debilitating, as many women experience. The medical industry calls this dysmenorrhea. There was no other real reason for it that they knew. It's just, you're broken. It's you're broken. And they can't figure out why. And so what they do is they just put you on birth control, because birth control improves the symptoms quite a bit. So well, in fact, that, I just went decades on birth control, because if I didn't have it, I mean, even when I did have it, I had to take like overdose on Advil every month, to my liver's great detriment. And so, over those years, it was just easy. And plus, when you're on birth control, you can kind of control the schedule of when, so, hey, I'm going to have that beach vacation. Maybe I'll just extend this a week and then I won't have my period then, like all the ways you can manipulate your body. And so I did that for years. And finally, when I was ready to get married, I went off birth control and said, hey, I need to figure this out. Like, what's going on? Is my uterus okay? Is it broken? What's happening? And what I found is that I finally got a diagnosis of endometriosis. And, it's hard to know exactly what endometriosis is, because no one's really invested research money in it at the NIH or anywhere else. Because why? Well, because we can just put people on birth control. We don't need, and by the way, when you put a teenage girl with bad period cramps on birth control, you get this extra bonus that she's not going to get pregnant. Woohoo! So why would we ever actually research why these women's fertility and reproductive system, which is a glaring red flag about a woman's health, if her reproductive system is broken in some way or dysfunctional, that is a huge red flag as to what's going on. And so, I want to get married. We start to try to have a baby. That's the first thing we wanted to do, is try to have a baby. We were pretty old at that point. We didn't want to waste any time. And what I found is that we weren't getting pregnant. And so as I started to look into it, well, it turns out that this endometriosis was kind of uncurable. And by the way, there's also this ovarian problem that no one had ever noticed or diagnosed. And so I was told I was infertile. Nobody told me to hey, maybe change your diet. Maybe look into if you're getting sleep or check your stress levels. Like, nobody actually went to the root cause of why my fertility might be broken or irregular or dysfunctional. Nobody even, I just got this, you're infertile diagnosis. And so, okay, so I believed that for some insane reason. I believed that oh, this white coat in front of me is Almighty God and has all the answers. And so I okay. And so then we adopted children, and I love them and they're wonderful. But I mean, My goodness, like now, later in life, I started a more serious health journey and became a naturopathic doctor. And now I realize I bet I wasn't infertile. I just ate like garbage. I was Diet Coke crackhead. I mean, there's so many things I could have tried and nobody tried. But instead, that birth control pill for all those years, what it did, it's not that it broke me. What it did is it masked the symptoms of the brokenness that was already there so that there was no interest or incentive to actually figure out the root cause of what was going on until it was too late. And that is one of the problems among many others with birth control. Of course, another problem with birth control is that it messes up your mental health. It can certainly create weight gain. It can create all kinds of other problems. There have been studies that it actually changes your brain in ways that you are attracted to different types of men. So women who are on birth control, it's been shown through studies that they actually are attracted to more beta men. It's crazy. Even when they're just looking at photos of beta men versus alpha men, like really masculine looking men versus softer, more effeminate looking men. Women who are on birth control actually prefer the more effeminate looking men. So that was actually a study I had heard, which is why I went off it when I was in the dating pool and wanting to get married, is because I'm like, I don't want to be attracted to the wrong kind of guy. And it's true the other way around, actually. So they did studies on men too, and they showed them pictures of women who were on birth control versus women who were not, and they were more attracted to the women who were not, and they didn't know which was which.
Wow.
And women were given, it's funny, women who were on birth control versus women who were not were given T-shirts that had been worn by different types of men, sort of the alpha versus the beta, and they smelled the T-shirts, and they preferred the smell of the beta men if they were on birth control. So it's changing male and female dynamics in very interesting ways. Animals, we talk about pheromones and sexual attraction among animals, but we are animals and we have these, when you're with a person, there is chemistry, there is real connection, human connection between people, whether they're men and women or even just between other women or other men. We have human connection. That's why the COVID lockdowns were so devastating, is cutting us off from that something real and spiritual that happens when you're together. But part of that real and spiritual is physical too. And, so birth control is changing us. It's changing women in ways that we don't even understand. And it could be harming us, not to mention that it also, in many cases, is abortifacient. If you look at the FDA label on most forms of birth control, whether it's a pill or it's a long-acting device that's implanted or whatever, it acts in three ways. The first way is that it prevents ovulation, but that doesn't always work, especially with the low doses of estradiol that are in these medications. And because they added progestin into these medications as well. So then what it also does is it changes your cervical mucus. Your cervical mucus changes throughout your monthly cycle. And during their most fertile time of your monthly cycle, when you're ovulating, the cervical mucus is very clear and liquidy and stringy. And it's designed to be a sort of warm, welcoming mat for sperm. It's designed to help sperm enter the uterus and get through the cervix. And so it changes your cervical mucus so that it's not as easy for that to happen. That's the second way that the birth control pill acts. The third way, and this is where it's abortifacient, is it reduces your uterine lining. It thins the lining inside your uterus so that it's hard for an already created embryo to implant in the uterine wall. And so the embryo won't be able to implant and it will just flush out of your uterus. So that's how they're abortifacient. So do we want to be participating in potential abortions? I think a lot of women go on to birth control so they don't have to face that kind of question.
Gosh, I didn't even know that last part. That is, something that I never heard of. And I'm pretty sure people that are watching right now are probably going to be, just shocked because we don't know a lot of the stuff that we're putting in our bodies, which leads me to another thing. The FDA. Okay, people tend to, oh, well, this is FDA approved, we should trust it. Or big doctors, like you said, white coats approve it. It sounds great. what are your whole thoughts on the FDA? And I think, and I know I watched this on another podcast. I think it was Real Alex Clark over at Turning Point. She made a point, and I said, no, that's true. That kind of after COVID, people started questioning a lot, from the conservative side, have said, hey, I don't know. We've always been not really trusting the government. I don't really know if we can trust people like, from the FDA and the medical science that is being pushed on us now. Yeah, why do you think that now we're starting, or why should we question what's being given to us? Because you would think doctors should want to make us better. That's their job, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the wonderful silver lining of COVID is that exactly what you're describing is it opened everyone's eyes to the absolute lack of trustworthiness by our regulatory agencies that are actually, they're designed, they're built, we're paying them to take care of us, but instead they're taking care of these big greedy corporations that they're protecting them from us instead of us from them. So that's really scary, and that's true on the food side as well as it is on the drug side, the Food and Drug Administration. And it's true not only at FDA, which regulates a lot of food and all of drugs and medical devices, but it's also true at USDA, which regulates a lot of other types of food. And it's true at EPA, which regulates environmental toxins that might be in our water or in agriculture. So, it's really important. All three of those agencies are really important to protecting us from giant corporate interests. And I think about this, having worked in Republican politics for so much of my career, for a long time, we just sort of knee-jerk defended big corporate interests. Like we thought that was Republican policy because, free market, right? Like free market is somehow better. And we don't want the government to take over all these industries, whether it's food or drugs. And so, we have to stand up for these big companies. And I think we had these knee-jerk reactions, even as over time, these big companies were becoming indefensible in how they behaved. We were still defending them. And I saw that change during the Trump administration. And in fact, it's one of the things that attracted me to candidate Donald Trump when I first was working on his campaign, before I worked on his campaign, is because I noticed that he was sort of challenging some of these Republican orthodoxies in a really populist way, as opposed to a liberal kind of, Marxist way, like let's have the government take over all this. It wasn't that. It was just let's be smart and not let these companies push us around and look out for the little guy. And I think that ethos has really started to take over more and more of the Republican Party. And I think that's really welcome. But COVID kind of opened that up. It sort of burned down the political divide, really. I think a lot of people actually started seeing this. And I'm grateful actually for the pandemic because, it opened my eyes in a lot of ways. I was a traditional epidemiologist, and I thought that vaccines were like the gold standard of public health. And, that all these scientists at these regulatory agencies were, maybe they weren't the best in the world, but, the pharmaceutical companies had to submit these clinical trials, and there were like scientists looking at the clinical trials methodology, and I'm sure it was all on the up and up, right? And it really opened my eyes to look at the clinical trials more closely, and also to see the ways that the FDA was seeking to hide information. Because here we are in the internet age. I mean, it's very possible that all this has been going on for decades and decades, but now in sort of this like alternate internet knowledge economy that we have, where you really can't hide information anymore.
Yeah.
It made it possible for people to submit FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, and try to get clinical trial data out of the FDA. The FDA then sued to not have to do that. And when they lost that suit, they said, okay, well, we can't get all this information out for 75 years. They don't take us that long. And of course, the court was like, no. So, just seeing the lengths that they went to and the intervention by Pfizer in that lawsuit to try to protect their own reputation when the lawsuit wasn't even, they weren't a party to the lawsuit, but they were still involved. I think people need to know that, I want to say 2 decades or so ago, there was a big change in the FDA budget and the USDA as well, where the companies that are regulated and approved or disapproved by these entities, by these organizations of our government, Congress passed this law that said, we're going to start charging these companies user fees. And the user fees are, in theory, designed to help fund the agency that's regulating them. It seems kind of reasonable, like we pay fees to register our driver's license, or, in theory, it's supposed to be paying for some of the costs of carrying out that activity, even I guess our taxes aren't enough. But when they did that, it's grown. That user fee program has grown and grown, especially at the FDA. And it's now more than half the budget of the FDA. And so that's half the budget of the FDA being funded by big pharma. And medical device companies. So that's not a place where we want to be.
No.
The money talks, and that agency, CDC has a foundation out there called the CDC Foundation that big corporations donate to. And it's sort of this extra statutory taxpayer, it's outside the taxpayer funding stream, where, of course, we have accountability. We have accountability when it's taxpayer money, not much, but some. And, but when you start having these private foundations that are funding these public agencies, or user fees where you have private corporations funding these agencies, like, that's not good. That takes the agency's activities outside of the democratic process. And it's not okay. And I think that one of the most important reforms that we need to enact in a future administration in the post-COVID era is to end the user fee program. We've got to get these agencies back to where they serve the public, at least on paper. They serve the public, not anyone else, and really start holding them accountable to that. There are many, many other reforms that need to happen as well, but that's at least one of them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I know I'm going to switch it over a little bit to something specific, which I know a lot of women suffer from cancer, and sometimes specifically breast cancer. So I want to know, what are your thoughts on hormone supplements for women maybe over 50 and who've had breast cancer, specifically progesterone and DHEA?
Okay, great question. So this actually, I think, is one of the bigger myths and sort of scientific fails in medicine, and it's not in the direction that you think. So in the early 2000s, the Women's Health Initiative, which is a huge study run out of Harvard, came out and said, they announced, basically by press release, the authors of the study announced that they had found a link between hormone replacement therapy for women and breast cancer. And this became gospel. It was repeated over and over again. It became gospel. If you actually look at the study, they found no such thing. So the results they found were not even really, in that direction. And the little bit that it was not statistically significant. In scientific terms, it didn't happen. There is no relationship between the two, between hormone replacement therapy and breast cancer, using the statistical methods that they used and the findings that they published openly. I mean, anyone could have looked at the study and said, wait, that confidence interval or that, p-value is not statistically significant. Like, it's very strange to me that this groupthink occurred. And it confirms for me more and more what I saw during COVID, which I've always known, but, man, you have these like crystallizing moments that really solidify it. And that's just that medicine is a religious groupthink cult. I mean, these white coats, they're weeded out in the medical education process for those who are conformist group thinkers who can regurgitate what they're told. That's what you have to do in medical school. That's what you have to do in residency. Nobody's looking for critical thinkers or problem solvers. No one's looking for independent thinkers. That's not what gets you admitted to medical school or through a residency program or through your board certification exams at all. So, we're creating a bunch of little drones in white coats, and yet we place on them this massive amount of public trust and authority. So back to the breast cancer study, I mean, this is coming out more and more. There's going to be a book on this actually that's coming out soon, written by a friend of mine, but I think it'll make a splash because the book is going to be about all the ways, there's a chapter on all the things that, medicine has gotten really, really wrong and harmed people seriously. So in fact, the studies suggest that hormone replacement therapy in women, postmenopausal women, if it started within 10 years of menopause symptoms starting, actually has increased health effects for when it comes to cardiovascular health, mental health, cancer risk, and a number of other things. So it's actually kind of shockingly good for you to be on hormone replacement therapy, I would never suggest that people take drugs when they don't need to take drugs. So I'm not saying that, women should all be on this. I'm just saying that, in fact, that was a huge myth. Thankfully, it doesn't cause breast cancer. That's not to say that other things are, that we're all safe from cancer, because back to the FDA discussion, like, there are many, many carcinogens that are approved that many of us are taking, especially the birth control pill is one of them. It's a group 1 carcinogen determined by the World Health Organization. So, I mean, they're not the most trusted authority, but on this matter, they group, they have a cancer unit, and they group potential carcinogens, and group 1 is the biggest carcinogen. So that's the worst cancer risk, and birth control pills are in that category. So, nothing's safe here.
No, and you know what? Let's talk about your background as a naturopath. So, a lot of people will think, well, I'm going to go to traditional doctors, and that's great for some things. But then sometimes traditional doctors may suggest, I'm going to give you this pill. I'm going to give you this pill to treat a symptom. But we want to, like you said earlier, want to get to the root cause. A lot of the diseases that we have nowadays, can they be preventable? And if so, what are some practical things that we could do? Maybe even school us on things like heavy metal toxins that people would say, oh no, that's hippy dippy. And then wait, what? There's this thing that we need to watch out for. And then we need to look at the ingredients in our food. I mean, yes, let's say we have a person who's like, I have this disease, or I want to prevent a disease that my parents have. What do I need to do it? Just take a pill?
Yeah, so I think it's important to sort of back up a little bit and think about what is involved in medical education and what are medical doctors taught, and what are they not taught. So what they're taught is what to prescribe when you see lab result X. So you see lab result X or symptom Y, here's what we prescribe in this dosage. That's what they're taught. They're not, I mean, the amount of hours that they spend in medical school on nutrition or root cause or prevention is minuscule compared to how much they spend on memorizing symptoms and labs and drug dosages. They also, it's very important to remember that I think we always think that our average community doctor or, our specialist, our cardiologist out there in the world, that they are the experts in their field and they're up to speed on all the latest science. But these are very, very busy people, very busy. They see patients all day. They're usually running like a chicken with their head cut off, trying to fit more patients in because that's the only way they pay their bills is how many 7-minute visits can I get in a day because I'm paid by the 7-minute visit by insurers. And so they're seeing patients all day and then they're charting and making notes and trying to like catch up on paperwork. Basically into the night. And so by the time they get home at 8 or 9, they're seeing their family for the first time. Like they don't have time to read the medical literature and keep up to speed on, the latest clinical trials on this or that.
Yeah.
So even within the traditional medical field and the traditional scientific enterprise, these are not the experts. So your cardiologist, your community oncologist, your primary care doctor, your OBGYN, they are not the experts in even their own field, much less any other specialist field. So that oncologist, knows nothing about cardiovascular disease, and the cardiologists know nothing about the endocrine system or, the orthopedic system. And so, they are taught in these like segregated units. You do an OB rotation and you have a rotation on, labor and delivery, and you have a rotation on pediatrics, and you have a rotation on cardiology, and it's like they break up the body into the sum of its parts. We're so much more than the sum of our parts. And what we know about the human body, which is metaphysically unbelievable, right? Like the human body works in organic ways that are so much more complex and inscrutable than the mechanical ways that doctors look at us. And so they think that our heart is, a pump and here's how it works mechanically, when in fact we are a battery and we are a battery. Everything in this earth is charged with electricity and electromagnetic fields. We have a field, an electromagnetic field that extends feet past our body. That's what I was talking about when I talk about when you're interacting in person with somebody. Your fields are overlapping and they affect each other through electron transfers and electricity within your body. When we go out barefoot into the grass, the electrons from the earth, which is negatively charged, come up into our body and change the structure of water in our body. And we are a majority water. So that changes a lot. So, I mean, there's so much out there that isn't studied at all in traditional schools of medicine and isn't even heard of or understood at all. And it takes crazy things like bug biologists to come and start opening up the secret of nutrition, which has actually happened. There are these bug biologists that have discovered really important nutritional concepts that the nutrition field was embarrassed that they had never figured out before with respect to how much protein we need versus fats or carbs. So, I mean, I would just say this is not to slam doctors because we need traditional medicine. If I get in a car wreck and I've got like broken bones or I've got a bullet in my body, if my body is broken, there is no one better than an American emergency room on earth. There is nowhere I want to be than a trauma bay in an American emergency room because we can put people back together like nobody's business. But if I have diabetes or cardiovascular disease, or I'm infertile, or, I have mental health issues that like an MD very well may not be the solution. They're simply throwing band-aids of drugs and chemicals to suppress my symptoms. But our bodies are not stupid. They're not like accidentally broken. Like you don't see, I mean, that's just not how biological systems work. Like if you look at an ecosystem of a pond or an ecosystem in a swampland or whatever, if one thing changes, the rest of the environment changes around it. There are rational responses, there are actions and reactions, and our bodies are no different. If you're experiencing symptoms, there's a reason for that. It's not like just random malfunction like a computer virus. There is a reason. And if you suppress those symptoms, you're suppressing vital information. And you're also suppressing your body's attempt to heal because that's what it's doing. A fever, your body is trying to get toxins out of you. It's trying to kill infections. It's trying to, sweat out poisons. And if you suppress those symptoms like we all do for our little babies and children, we just like try to suppress their symptoms. Don't let them have a fever. That fever is so essential and it's your body protecting you. And that's true of every symptom is your body's attempt to heal and to bring you back into balance and homeostasis. If we suppress those symptoms, we're just delaying and prolonging disease. And so I'm not saying that some symptoms there are some symptoms and some disease processes that are so far advanced or so severe that we do need some help. We need assistance to get through those symptoms. But in most cases, that is the first place that a doctor is going to go is to suppress those symptoms. And we've been brainwashed and programmed that like, that's what we want. Just make it feel better, doc. Like, give me something to make it feel better. And, I'm sympathetic with that. Of course, I was on birth control for 30 years, but I mean, it's not helping us. And at the end of the day, it masked my symptoms to where the disease process was too far gone. Or maybe it was. I'm not sure at the time. Maybe I could have fixed it at the time if someone had given me advice about nutrition or stress. But we really need to be looking at our bodies as a whole, as a holistic. And if you think about a little tiny pill that you take, think about the size and the volume of just that chemical that you're putting in your body. Yes, it can have an effect. It can even have a dramatic effect. But now think about the volume and size of food that you put in your body every day or liquid that you put in your body every day. It's far, far, far more vast in volume and size than that little pill. And so you think about ways that we could change what's going on in our body by our food and our drink, like just that one step is so huge and many diseases are being reversed now with just dietary changes, not to mention sleep and exercise and sunlight and relationships and all the other things that our bodies react to.
Everything you're saying, I'm agreeing with. And I know I've done some research on my own and I've started looking at the labels of food. And, now I'm paying attention to what's grass fed versus grass finished versus this and that. And seed oils is another thing that I'm like, oh gosh, cut that out. Sugars, eliminating all of that. And, I've seen people and I've heard stories of people's, reversing diseases, getting cured from cancer, things like that because of certain dietary changes. And I'm thinking, wow, I wish this information was more readily available, especially because, for example, cancer rates are so high right now. And of course, mental health issues are everywhere. And I'm thinking, sometimes I look at it from a biblical perspective when the Bible talks about fasting and how important fasting is, the things that God created. Sometimes people would say a holistic approach to health is, for the hippies or the weirdos. And it's like, no, when we take it, not for the new age, stuff, but when we take a look at, God gave us animals to eat, God gave us vegetables to eat, just depending on, different things. I'm like, if we took a simple approach instead of, oh, let me get this quick junk food that most of ingredients were made in a lab, maybe we wouldn't have a lot of the issues that we have today. And for some people, it's easier to pop a pill than to put in the work. And I understand. I know self-control is not only a fruit of the spirit, but it's something that we all struggle with. Self-control can include food, the ability to choose the right food and to give in to the junk food. So, you know, that's my thought on that. So I love everything you're saying. I'm taking it all in. And I'm going to switch a little. I want to know your thoughts on vaccines. I know you mentioned it earlier. What are your thoughts on vaccines in general, and maybe specifically for, new moms who are thinking, well, of course I'm going to give my child a vaccine. I know that there's so many opinions on this. So I want to know your perspective, from adult vaccines to vaccines for babies.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental thing that we need to think about with respect to vaccine safety and efficacy is the clinical trials that were done for each vaccine. And you can look on the label of each vaccine in order to find this, and you don't have to have the physical label. You can look up the label, just put in FDA label, tetanus vaccine. And if you Google that, you'll find the FDA label. It's basically like a technical document. It's usually 5 to 10 pages. And what it is it's that little tiny print, huge unfolded packet insert that's in every drug that you take. Now, the problem is you don't get sent home with that when you're getting a vaccine at your doctor's office. Your doctor opens that package somewhere else and then brings the needle into you. So you don't ever see that package insert. So it's good to look it up online before you go. So the thing you want to think about is, did that vaccine have a clinical trial when it was first approved? Not like generations of that vaccine later, but when it was first approved, where a blinded placebo randomized controlled trial happened, where it was a placebo control group. So what that means is we took two groups, one group that we vaccinated and one group that we did not vaccinate at all. And usually what that means is we injected saline into them so that they kind of thought they were being vaccinated, because it's important that both groups think that they're getting the same treatment. Because your mind has massive amounts of power, and the placebo effect has a 30 to 33% impact, which I can talk about in a minute. But so our mind is so powerful. We're created in the image of God. When he thinks it, when he speaks it, it is. And that is true for us. What we think and believe is in our body. And so, yes, if you need to have a control group where the group does not get a vaccine, and the reason for that is the vaccines have two parts. They have a part that is the active part, that active thing that is like the dead virus or the synthetic virus protein that is supposed to simulate the virus. That's the active ingredient. But there's also everything else, the adjuvant. So what a vaccine is doing usually is it's putting a toxin of sorts, like a piece of the virus or the bacteria, or whatever it is, into you. And it's also putting some other toxins, like known toxins, into you. Why? Because it wants to train your immune system to react to the specific poison of the vaccine. But DNA from a virus isn't poisonous. It's just DNA from a virus. So your immune system is not going to react to that DNA. They need to put a poison in there to make your immune system react. So it teaches your immune system, oh, I get all inflamed when I see this little harmless piece of DNA. Next time I see this harmless piece of DNA, I'm going to get inflamed again. And that's what the vaccine is doing by design, in theory, right? And so the poisons that they're putting in there in the adjuvant, which is sort of the liquid that the vaccine comes in, that is essential. And so the problem with the clinical trials for most vaccines, actually all but COVID and a little bit of hepatitis B, I believe. No, HPV, human papillomavirus. The problem with all of the vaccines is that they did not have a control group, a true control group. The control group that they used was another vaccine. So they took like, okay, we're going to test this measles vaccine against the last generation of the measles vaccine, an older measles vaccine. The problem is then you're testing the body's reaction to the two different active ingredients, because that's what's changed. The poisons that are in the adjuvant have not changed. They're the same in both. So when the clinical trial results show that there's no difference in reaction, in symptoms or adverse events between the two groups, that doesn't tell you anything, because the two groups got the same poisons or very similar types of poisons. So that's problem one. We don't have any clinical trials with placebo controls. Rather, we have control groups that are based on another vaccine, which has a toxic brew in it, just like the vaccine I'm testing. So that's a problem. The second problem is that we don't usually do clinical trials of the entire vaccine schedule. We just do one. But even in a single well baby visit, your baby could be getting 5 vaccines at a time. We haven't done the test of what is the clinical trial when you get 5 vaccines. So when I was growing up, when I was getting vaccinated was in the 70s. I grew up mostly in the 80s, but I was little in the 70s. And, I got like 3, maybe 5 doses, 5 different vaccines. I mean, at most. And there were maybe 10 doses of those or 8 doses of those. So, maybe 2 shots for this, 3 shots for that, whatever. 8 doses. Today, there are more than 70 vaccine doses from 0 to 18. And dozens of those happen before the age of 2. Several can even happen on the first day of birth, including a vaccination for hepatitis B, which is a sexually transmitted disease. Why your baby needs a poisonous vaccine shot into them on the day 1 to protect them against a sexually transmitted disease is like insanity. And there are corporate greed reasons behind this. So I think it's important to remember the financial interests at play. And, all this would be okay. I mean, it's kind of terrible that we don't have really good data and all our approvals are based on, the last vaccine that was 5 years ago and then the one before that. And, when you go back all the way to the very first one, well, that was in 1948 before we had clinical trial requirements. So we just grandfathered that one in. Like, that's how bad it is. Like, all the way back, there's no placebo control. So if that weren't bad enough, I mean, the fact that like we're just vaccinating our babies with dozens and dozens of things that have never been tested together and their impact together. And all these vaccines have these adjuvants in them, especially, there used to be mercury in them. There still is mercury in flu vaccines. There still is. So that's troubling. Obviously, there's no safe exposure level for mercury. It is a neurotoxin of the highest order, and it can kill you when it's in higher doses. But and in fact, the dose of mercury that's in the vaccine is many, many times more than the allowable amount if it's in food. So it's really scary because you're injecting it right into the blood. Your GI tract at least has some protections to kind of protect you against bad stuff and toxins. It's designed to protect you. But when it's in your blood, like your blood doesn't have that. So this is all very scary. And I would say that the biggest problem here in a market environment, when there are products on the market, you would choose whether to use them. And if they harmed you, you could sue. But in 1986, I believe it was, Congress passed a law that prevented people from suing pharmaceutical manufacturers for vaccines. And so now we can't even sue if they're harmed. Now, if you took away the legal liability for, any drug, what incentive would there be for that drug manufacturer to make sure it's safe and effective? Like, really, what would the incentive be? There isn't any. And then if you lobby to get your drug put on the childhood schedule so that everyone has to buy it, I mean, you've really won the lottery, haven't you? You're not responsible for, the government's going to pay out any claims to injured people because that's what happens. You can't sue them. You can take your case to a vaccine court through the government, which is garbage, and you can't usually win there, but that's the system. So they're not liable for any harms. They can, no matter how reckless their behavior, no matter how dangerous their product, they can't be sued. And yet they're required for school entrance in almost every state. So it's like a guaranteed market for them. I mean, they won the lottery. And I just don't trust the process. I mean, we started off this conversation talking about the regulatory capture and the political hackery at the FDA. So I do not see any signs of hope here. I mean, there's the committees that recommend approval. There's one at FDA and there's one at CDC. The one at FDA recommends approval. These are outside experts that recommend approval at the FDA. And then there's outside experts at the CDC that recommend putting it on the childhood schedule. So those two committees are supposed to be these independent experts that really are influential as to the decisions that these agencies make. And what happens is they're not actually independent experts. They're all on the payroll of pharmaceutical manufacturers. All of them have conflicts of interest, which are not supposed to be allowed, and they're required that they disclose these conflicts, but they don't. They've waived those ethical requirements for reasons unknown. And they claim that, well, if we didn't do it, we wouldn't get any experts because all the experts are bought and paid for by the pharma industry. Like, that's not reassuring, So I think the entire industry is corrupt. So I'm not saying that there couldn't be a safe and effective vaccine. I'm saying that we don't know that these are the ones that are, and there's a million incentives for them not to be.
I really enjoyed having you on today. I feel like our viewers are going to be so much more educated after listening to our talk. And again, I want to just thank you for hanging out with me today and for giving us the wealth of knowledge that you've shared. And if I could encourage our viewers anything, I would say, please do your homework. Do your research, get with your creator, read the Bible. Honestly, I feel like our gut and our mind, it goes together. And I just think that like the Bible does talk about renewing our minds. And a lot of times the way we think affects our emotions, our mood, it affects our health, it affects everything. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to come and talk to me today. Honestly, you're just a wealth of knowledge, and I want to thank you. And I definitely hope that we can have another conversation in the future.
That would be great, Brittany. It's been such a delight to be with you.
Katy, I'm so proud of you, and I'm so grateful for all that you're doing, that you're fighting for. Like I mentioned earlier in our conversation, you just remind me of an Esther, going forward and having the courage. And I want to encourage any other women that are watching this show, to have the courage like Esther. And we don't need to be raging feminists who are always angry. No, we can have, like the Bible talks about in Peter, this gentle and quiet spirit and speak with truth. And I'm so grateful again that we've had this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brittany. God bless you.
Friends, I want to know, what are your thoughts on this conversation that I had with Katy? Do you want to see more videos and more interviews like this? I enjoy doing them. I want to help bring the gospel to you, and also things where we are stewarding our bodies well. So whether that's health and spiritual things, which a lot of times they go together, I definitely want to bring that to you. But let me know your thoughts on the conversation. And of course, make sure that you guys are following me on social media. And of course, subscribe to this channel if you're not, and share this video with all your friends. Until next time, I'm Brittany Valadez for bravelydaily.com. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.